Welcome, everybody. Come on, grab a seat. Thank you all for being here on this beautiful, warm Wednesday afternoon. We're going to talk today about 20% projects here at Google. And I've got two of my colleagues, Andrew Hogue, Zach Lloyd, and we're going to tag team our way through this. Let's see. Oh, we have the clicker here. Okay, so that's the three of us. Okay. So a whole lot of interesting things out of Google started as 20% projects. You'll hear more about them during the presentation. More than just the icons that I showed there. Some of our products don't have very particularly attractive icons, but some of them do. Up. And Zach Lloyd will tell us a little bit about what 20% projects are all about. We're going to be working in reverse alphabetical order by first letter of last name.
Hi there, is this working? Cool. So my name is Zach Lloyd. I'm a manager on Google Docs, and in particular I manage the spreadsheets part of it, which is all Google Docs, or most of it, is run out of the New York office here. I've been working at Google for about 4.5 years, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about what 20% projects are, what are typical projects that people do, like what are sort of the ground rules at Google for working on 20%. So let me go ahead and get started. Okay, so when I tell people I work at Google, one of the first things that they typically ask me, they're like, oh, that's pretty cool, or whatever, they say something, but they always say, do you get a day a week to work on whatever you want? And I say, kind of, yeah, I kind of do get a day a week to work on whatever I want within some boundaries. It's like I can't go to the park a day a week, but as long as I pick something which might benefit Google, I can take 20% of my time and work on it. And you know, this isn't present at every company, but the idea behind it is that if you have a culture where engineers can take some time away from their main thing, which is the sort of company priority, what they've been asked to work on, and work on something which interests them, you will foster a community where you get innovation. So it's supported all the way from the top down, and it's been part of the Google culture for a long time, and it's a pretty deeply ingrained thing here. So the basics of it, the way it works is pretty much every engineer who works at Google gets to take 20% of their time to work on a side project if they want. You can start working on 20% pretty much as soon as you're comfortable and settled into your main project. So that might be a week, that might be a month, a couple months, but you can just start doing it. Is it really 20% of your time? The answer is yes, if you want it to be. And engineers here will divide it up sort of differently. Some people will do a couple hours a day, some people will do a day a week, some people will do a week every 5 weeks. Some people will sort of bank away their 20% time, save it up for a quarter, and then do a couple weeks of work at once. So it's very flexible.
What works best?
You know, it really depends on the engineer. Some people like doing it a little at a time. I like 1 day a week. That's the thing that's been most common that I've seen. And it depends on what you're working on too. So that brings me to the next question. So as a 20% project person, what can you work on? So the answer is it's really broad. You can work on pretty much whatever you want, so long as there's some potential benefit to Google. So it should be somehow related to Google or to your job or technology or something which might potentially one day benefit Google. But doesn't have to definitely benefit Google. And a lot of things that people have tried haven't worked, but it should be at least in the ballpark. This is a creepy slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different kinds of 20% projects that people do that I see them working on here. So within the kind of Google intranet, the guide, these are sort of the general categories that you see. So people can start a new project 20% of the time. You see this. People can work on something that already exists. They can tinker around with some code. It's not really a project. It could be an internal tool. They can work on an engineering intergroup as 20% of their time. And these are sort of cross-functional groups that exist within Google to promote best practices, that kind of thing. You can work on an open source project. You can teach something. You can teach a class. Or you can even just spend 20% of your time doing kind of professional enrichment. But I think the most interesting kinds of projects or the ones that you hear people talk about most when they think of 20% projects at Google are sort of these exploratory projects. So these are things that people kind of try to shoot the moon on, come up with the next big thing for Google. These would be things like Gmail or Goggles or I don't know, if Maps had been a 20% project. They're things that are somehow new and there's a sort of risk associated with them. So these are projects which engineers will tend to sort of have an idea, and it's a bottom-up process. You'll say, okay, in addition to my normal job function, I'm going to work on this big idea and try and come up with the next big thing for Google. A second kind of 20% project that I often see is the sort of small and fun project. It's the project where I'm working at Google. I like what I work on most of the time, but I want a break. I want a diversion. I want to work on a feature for Gmail. I'm someone who does databases, and I want to be able to make an Android app. So you see this kind of thing all the time too, and this is another great part of the 20%, is it can just be like, hey, I want something different some of the time, and it still adds value to Google, so Google is happy to encourage this kind of project. So in my particular work, people add features to our Google Docs all the time like this. People want to just, someone might add the spell checker, or someone will add some formulas, some different functions to Google Spreadsheets. Another big use of 20% project is a sort of precursor to moving around within the company. So on Google Docs, we get people approaching us all the time who they're working in some other part of the company. They're working in ads, they're working in search, infrastructure, whatever. They want to join the Google Docs team. Pretty much always the first thing that we ask them to do is to work on a 20% project for us. So this is implementing some small feature would be the typical thing. And it's a great way to see if there is a good fit between the new engineer and the team. You get into the code, and it's, again, another one of these very useful parts of having this flexibility in your job. And then finally, there's a sort of culture at Google where if you see something that's broken, rather than filing a ticket and having someone else fix it, the idea is you just fix it yourself. So there are people at Google who will spend their 20% time just kind of seeing things that drive them nuts and fixing them. You don't like the way the meetings are scheduled, you can fix it. You don't like the way the elevators go up and down, come up with like a way of making the elevators work better. So there's a ton of latitude in what kinds of 20% projects you might do. So I'll talk briefly about some 20% stuff that I've done, and then I will hand over the talk. We'll go tag team back to Marc. So for me, I did a 20% project of the kind of exploratory nature, which is I was working on Google Spreadsheets. I was doing sort of regular features, and I got fed up with kind of the way the code was architected, and I said, in my 20% time, I'm going to see if we can come up with a better way of rendering a spreadsheet UI. And I kind of tinkered a lot. No one asked me to do this, and eventually, I showed it to people. I was like, hey, what do you think? Should we be doing things this way? And people bought into it, and eventually we ended up rewriting the Spreadsheets UI to be based on this new technique that I was messing around with in my 20% time. So that was cool. I mean, that turned into kind of a big thing that a lot of people worked on. And then, there's one other one within Google Docs, which is a good example. So Google Apps Script, which is kind of the macro language for Google Docs, started when an engineer who was working on Google Spreadsheets, he'd worked with a certain technology at his last company, and he just, again, same sort of thing. No one asked him to do it, but he he just one day showed people. He's like, hey, look, you can use this technology to let people make custom spreadsheet functions. And people were like on the team were like, that's really cool. And now it's turned into completely its own thing with a bunch of engineers working on it and a lot of users, and it's a very important thing for the product. So, even in my personal experience, I've seen the 20% projects grow into really, really cool things. So that's it for me. With that, I hand it over to Marc.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, my 20% project was the art project, and it wasn't even a project for a very long time. It was kind of an exploration. So I'll tell you the story. Let's see. I think we're going to play a video. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this. This was a marketing video created for the art project early on. So I was born and raised here in Manhattan, the child of starving artists. And one of the things I discovered about being a starving artist is that it's not particularly comfortable. So I decided not to be an artist, at about age 10. Before that it was like I was going to be an artist like my mom. Okay, so I went to Caltech, got a PhD at CMU, and became a computer scientist. But I never lost interest in the art world. I just didn't want to be a starving artist. So after working for a while here in the New York area, I got involved in a CTO organization here. And as a result, I met the CIOs of most of the big museums here in the city, and had been thinking about this whole question of the digital museum. And I wrote a blog post on it before I joined Google. In fact, and the interesting thing, Google has been working on digitizing books for a while now, but the art problem is actually a very different and in some ways harder problem. So there have been some estimates of the total number of books in the world, and the range of estimates go between 70 and 170 million unique titles that have ever been published in all the languages worldwide since people have been creating books. You may think that's a lot of things, but just for comparison, the Smithsonian alone claims to have 136 million objects in its catalog. And that's one museum. There's 17,500 museums that are members of the US only American Museum Association. So there's a lot of objects in museums around the world. And because of that, only a tiny fraction of those things are on display. So for example, the Louvre reports that it displays about 35,000 objects, and the estimates are that the Louvre's collection is about 7 million objects. That's probably wrong by a factor of 10. But the best case is that they're displaying 0.5% of their collection. Now, another force and change driver in the museum space is the sort of the death of regional museums. Back, up until maybe a century ago, travel, or less than a century, 50 years ago, travel was slow, dangerous, and expensive. If you were traveling, you had to have a damn good reason. And in general, people didn't because it was slow, dangerous, and expensive. So as a result, every sort of major regional city around the world has a sort of a museum with a relatively broad, not very deep, and not very large, but sort of comprehensive collections, so that people there can sort of see, you know, paleontological things and art things and technology things in one place. Well, today travel is in fact fast, safe, and cheap by the standards of a century or more ago, and that's having a huge effect on the regional museums, which are basically dying. You know, why go to a regional museum in Podunk when you can come to New York and visit the Met and the MoMA and the Natural History Museum, or go to Washington and visit the Smithsonian, or go to London and visit the British, or go to Paris and see the Louvre. So the regional museums are changing their basic strategy. They're either becoming specialized collectors of extremely narrow things, so it makes it worthwhile to visit them, or more often they're just fading away. The collections are large and fragile. More fundamentally than all of that, you know, back to the point about the Louvre and their 0.5% on display, curators are imperfect. Caravaggio, who's now considered one of the great artists of the 1600s, was essentially forgotten for 300 or 400 years after he died, only basically rediscovered in the middle of the last century, now considered, you know, one of the gods of art. So the question I have is, how many other phenomenal artists are kind of languishing in the archives of museums around the world, given that only 0.5% of the things are on display? Okay, so my hypothesis has been that if we could get a large percentage of the museum collections in the world digitized, we could eventually begin to harness the world's population looking at the art and saying, gee, there's something really interesting over there that maybe the curators didn't notice, and sort of begin to change the way people think about art. You never quite know. So when I got here to Google, I had this sort of dream of the digital museum, and I began to, you know, sort of think about how Google might get involved in this. And Google has all these really incredibly powerful tools. One of the reasons why we can do what we can do in software is we've got what I call nuclear-powered hand tools. And that lets us build incredible software with relatively small teams in very short order. So I organized some brainstorming sessions with a variety of the engineers here, whoever was sort of interested, asking, okay, what could we, in fact, talk about if we went and visited the museum people? And we had the brainstorming sessions. We came up with some ideas, one of which actually is part of the art project, namely the museum view stuff, which is basically to take the head off of a street view car and put it on a cart. I'll show you a picture of that later on, and trundle it around inside a museum and create a walking tour of the inside of a museum. So in parallel in Europe, some people, a woman in the Madrid office persuaded the Prado to let Google finance the capture of 14 of their masterpieces and publish them originally in Google Earth and then subsequently in Maps. And that came out in 2009, and that was immensely cool. It was a huge undertaking because basically to capture a picture required closing down the gallery it was in and assembling this big framework of steel bars, and the camera would go up here and it would move over, take a picture, and move over, take a picture, and then there was a bunch of software to sort of knit it all together. And it was incredibly successful, and that led to the next phase of the Europe-driven project. They basically said, oh, we'll go to the national museums and you know, invite them to join this art project where we'll scan one of their masterpieces and sort of put them all together in a website. And they went around and talked to the big national museums, and were getting some good traction with them. And they came to New York and they hooked up with me, and they told me their plan. I said, gee, you know, we don't have national museums in the US in any real sense. I mean, there's the Smithsonian, I suppose, but it's not the big museum in the U.S. If you want the great museums, they're mostly sort of privately funded. I mean, tax exempt, you know, but there's the Met, there's the MoMA, there's a bunch of other things. And those guys have to worry about their funding streams. National museums in Europe are funded by the governments, and so they're not nearly so cautious about you know, marketing questions. Whereas in the U.S., the museums are basically afraid of channel conflict problems. So we adjusted our approach, and I introduced them to a bunch of the museums via my connections to the CIOs, and we started a bunch of conversations. One of the things we didn't understand is how clubby the museum world is. Basically, all the top museums know each other. They're all continuously talking to one another. So there was no conversation we had with one museum that every other museum in the world didn't know about within days. Which didn't hurt us in any way, because we weren't conducting anything in secret. But it both helped us in some ways and hurt us. It helped us in that, you know, once the word got out that Google was going around talking to museums, there was tremendous excitement and also tremendous fear. It turns out I discovered after a year or so later that one of the sources of the fear was that about 25 years ago, a major technology company had approached a bunch of museums and had gotten them to submit a bunch of their art to digitization, and there had been some fairly unpleasant experience vis-a-vis the licensing of that material that had sort of left emotional scars in the museum people. And so that was one of the reasons why we were faced with certain delicate conversations. Fortunately, we didn't actually ask for ownership of the digital images or licensing or sub-licensing rights, so that made it a little easier for them to work with us. And then part of the key, of course, in any of these things is to get someone major to jump first. And in the case of this, the MoMA here in New York jumped first. And the reason that worked was sort of interesting. The woman who was sort of the key decision maker at the MoMA was an art historian, still is, I'm sure. And when we told her about this, she said, oh yes, I know what you're talking about, because I am an art historian and I teach, and one of the paintings that I teach is Las Meninas, which is in the Prado and was one of the ones that the Prado project had digitized. And she said, it was, you know, earth-changing for me when you guys put that up there, because I could now see things in that painting that I've been teaching for 20 years that I was never able to see before, because I could get down to the point where a brushstroke was this big. Okay, so she was on board immediately, okay? And it was interesting, because I had a conversation with the Met sometime after that, and he was so jealous. He was so pissed off that you know, the MoMA had just like dived straight in without tremendous amount of anxiety over it, and the Met meanwhile was like, they were pondering fairly hard. Now, to be fair, the Met was in the middle of a director change, going from the old director to the new one, and there were a variety of other challenges to worry about. But they ultimately did come along and signed up. So we got the Met, we got the MoMA, the Frick, the Freer, a bunch of museums, so a total of 17 museums. So meanwhile, the Street View guys, we had reached out to, you know, with this idea of museum view, and they built that cart. Can you see that there? It's very cool. And it's basically, you know, a re-engineered Street View camera built into a thing with a battery and so on, and it's sort of cool. And you push it around, and it takes pictures of the interior of the place. So basically, what we ended up with is a gigapixel image, which is incredibly high resolution. It basically lets you zoom down to, you know, again, where a brushstroke is this big. A museum view tour of each museum, of some part of it. Not every museum said the whole thing. They'd go a couple of galleries or this or that. And then we built a website which basically let us present the images in the gigapixel image browser. And it turns out the museums were, because the museums, these high-end museums that we're dealing with, have plenty of capability of their own. We weren't teaching them anything they didn't already know. So in fact, when the time came, we didn't just get the 17 gigapixel pictures that we had originally signed up for. We got, I don't know, over 1,000 pictures in total. We got the viewing guides and variety of sort of information about the art from the curators, and we built as part of it this thing, the My Art collection. So if you sign into the site, you can select individual things, and you get sort of along the lower bar of the screen, you get sort of your pictures. So you can make up a collection of the things that you like particularly, regardless of what museums they happen to come from. So it's kind of an early social art feature. Now, there were all kinds of challenges trying to make all of this work. First of all, in order to put the Street View stuff together, you rely on good, XY location of the cart at every photograph. And guess what? No GPS inside the building. So we had a number of interesting challenges. I won't go into the details, but they were tricky. A lot of inertial navigation, a lot of all kinds of corrections, a lot of game playing. The team did some remarkable work. One of the things we learned, which we didn't expect, was that lighting inside of buildings is actually harder than lighting outside. You say, wait a second, outside I've got the bright sunlight, da, 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 and the answer is inside a building I've got a window, so I've got all the bright light that I get outside, as well as all kinds of ranges of shadow inside. So it turns out that the dynamic range that we needed outside was not enough to support doing it inside, and we had to actually redo everything and rebuild our entire process for a much wider dynamic range. A lot of information. Again, the museums, once they sort of got interested in doing this, wanted to put a lot of information in there, lots more pictures than we had originally expected, and then there were, the sort of quality control things. The museums wanted to review and approve every museum view picture. Now that turned out to be, in some cases it's like, there's one I'll show you a little later on, which is actually quite amusing. There are times when it really is important to exclude certain pictures. But it also means that some of the museum view tours seem remarkably jumpy, and your sense of situational awareness is very disturbed because you go forward and suddenly you're teleported somewhere else. So we have work to do in terms of getting this kind of thing to the quality level that we all really want. Here's an example of the quality control. This is the room called the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. And we took that, and it's up, in fact. And if you look closely, there's a little, you can just see it there, and I picked it out and blew it up. There's the cart, self-portrait of the cart in Versailles. And that's the kind of stuff we had to contend with. So we had a big launch on the 1st of February. All kinds of celebrities and press and all that stuff at the Tate Modern in London. It was rather more successful than we anticipated, both in terms of usage and in terms of sort of critical response. So the net result of that was that the traffic to the site has been phenomenal, but more fundamentally, the museums who we had to woo and seduce to get interested in this in the first place are now basically tearing down the doors trying to get into the project. And there was a wonderful interview with the director of the Uffizi who basically talked about the impact of the art project. It drove traffic to his website 5x, which is, because one of the things we provide in each of the pages is links back to the museum's own site. But in addition, it doubled his foot traffic. Okay, so the fears about channel conflict and cannibalization of traffic turned out not to be true. In fact, they turned out to be the opposite of what was expected. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew for
Great. Thanks, Marc. So with that kind of great overview of a project that I think we can all agree was kind of wildly successful and is going to go on for a very long time, I kind of wanted to take a step back and talk about 3 instances that I've been involved in of 20% projects. That one that worked, kind of possibly on par with the art project, one that definitely didn't, and then one that kind of turned out pretty different than I expected it to. Just so you know me, I work in the search group here in New York. You might remember me from such Google and NYC Tech Talk meetups as the structured search engine, if anybody was here for that. So I've been at Google for about 7 years. I've had kind of a wide variety of 20% and 80% experiences. So there we go. So the first one that I was involved in, strictly speaking, it was David Petras' project, but I kind of helped get him get it off the ground, was what's now known as Google Goggles. It was originally known as Unveil internally, and David was actually well, I'll see. So David was originally an engineer on the Big Table project. So you might have heard of Big Table. It's our big structured, scaled database that we use here at Google for large quantities of data. So David was kind of in this project. It was exciting for him in terms of like scale and doing interesting things. But he had this kind of itch that I think a lot of engineers have, where your main project is kind of structured and working out really well. You want to do something kind of crazy and interesting on the side. So Goggles actually started out with some software that we had acquired from a company called Navin Vision that only so far at Google, after a couple of years, been used as part of Picasso. So basically they were using it to recognize things in Picasso and help you automatically label and group your images in Picasso. So David was sitting there and looking at this and thinking, man, this is it's kind of cool. I can categorize my Picasso albums, but there's got to be something else to this, right? We've got all these like fantastic machine vision researchers in Santa Monica. They're doing this crazy PhD level stuff. But really, if Picasso is really the only end result, maybe there's something cooler we can do here. So David's idea was basically, okay, instead of treating this as an organizational tool, let's treat it as a search tool. David had worked a little bit in web search. He had thought a little bit about what we do in a search as far as universal search. So if you type in a business in Google, we'll find you a business, a local listing. If you type in something that you want an image, we'll show you images. So he thought, well, why don't we take that idea of search and combine it with the idea of being able to recognize things in photos and build a visual search engine that's actually universal. So he took the Navin technology that was going on in Santa Monica. It was only being used for Picasso, and he built a little demo, right? So this is kind of how a lot of, as Zach mentioned before, how a lot of 20% projects start off. Somebody has a crazy idea. They talk to the people they need to, figure out how to kind of hack together something. And for David's case, it was a little Android app that basically you could point at something, like a logo on a Coke bottle or something like that, and it would find that thing, find its name, and then do a web search for it, right? So kind of not that crazy of an idea if you've already got the Picasso technology, but kind of a totally new format for it that turned out to be really compelling. And then the next step was basically he started shopping this around. Again, kind of a natural evolution that 20% projects take. You show it to somebody, they get excited, they tell somebody else about it, they come by and say, can I see a demo? And then kind of all of a sudden he has vice presidents like fighting over who's going to sponsor his project. So this was like, this is kind of a good example of kind of a successful 20% project, almost too successful. So they kind of doubled down. This is where I kind of got involved a little bit. I helped them find more engineers for it. We built a team. We ended up with 3 or 4 people in New York working on it, a bunch of people in Santa Monica doing the vision stuff. We built an Android app, launched a couple years ago. And this is kind of now being held up as one of the standards for visual search. There's kind of a general competitive market now of people that are actually trying to build visual search engines and do these kinds of things. And one of the interesting things about Goggles is it actually bred more 20% projects. So it's like this kind of compounding effect, because now Goggles is cool. It's a full-scale 80% project. But other people want to be able to do their 20% projects as part of Goggles. So one person actually implemented the idea of taking the OCR that we do as part of Goggles and feeding into Google Translate. Kind of, a little no-brainer if you think of it. But now you can take it, you're in France, you don't know how to read the menu, take a picture of it, we send you back what that menu actually says. Another person wanted to be able to add contacts to their address book from business cards. Pretty simple, OCR, you take a picture of a business card, parse out where the address, the phone number, the name is, now you have a contact in your address book. I don't think that phone number works anymore though. So that's an example of kind of a 20% project that I think really worked well. Again, I can't take much credit for it. David did all the hard work. This one I can take total credit for and was an abject failure. So this was one of my, this is a long time ago. This is probably 6 or 7 years ago when I first joined Google. And I was kind of looking for my first 20% project. I wanted, I was having fun on my main project, which was, doing question answering stuff that I still do at Google. But, I wanted to try out something that I hadn't tried before. And I've been talking to my family, and my mom has, at this point, a computer, a Windows computer. And I'm over there like every month fixing it, right? I mean, like I'm sure anybody that's technical has this problem, right? All she wants to do is send an email. And the whole thing is like pop-ups and spam and malware and all kinds of things like that. So I'm thinking to myself, how can I solve this problem? And like good engineer, I start looking at Linux. And I realized that you can make these bootable CDs. So I'm like, wouldn't it be cool if I had this bootable CD, I give it to my mom, and all she has to do is when her computer's broken, if I can't get there, she throws it in the CD drawer, reboots her computer, and all that's there is Gmail, right? And maybe a chat window. And the thing that I never really quite solved is how to print, because at that point the bootable Linux distributions didn't really have good printer support, and you had to set things up. So it was a fantastic idea. I thought this was going to be great. So I forgot to advance the slide, but anyway, so this was her problem. This is what happened, right? So it turned out that there were a bunch of reasons that this didn't work out in retrospect. First of all, I'm a great, machine learning guy and things like that. I'm a terrible kernel hacker, as it turns out. Like I really, I'm good at Linux user, but I'm not very good at actually figuring out how to make the thing do exactly what I want, start things when it first comes up, and kind of be really easy. Like what I want it to be is actually, I guess, kind of what Chrome OS ended up being, which is you boot it, you log in with your Google credentials, and everything just kind of works. So I think maybe I'll say I was ahead of my time, I guess. So that was probably the main reason it didn't work. The second reason was that at that point, Zach talked a little bit about doing things that might actually help Google. At that point, I don't think there was really any exit within Google for this project, right? I mean, like it wasn't like Google really wasn't in the operating system business at that point. Now we are twice over. Google wasn't really thinking about, we were thinking about spam, but only in the context of Gmail and so on. So there wasn't really a lot of support other than me working on this, and that's kind of a hard thing. After a while, I just kind of gave up, and it was a cool idea. And now my mom has a Chromebook, and she's happy. So, okay, this is the slide's a little messed up here, but anyway. So my last 20% project is one that was kind of something that I was passionate about. It was a lot of fun. Turned out completely different than what I thought it was going to be. So I've had kind of a long-standing recreational interest, if that's possible, in things like bioinformatics and genetics. I find this kind of stuff fascinating. And what I really wanted to do is kind of find out a little bit more about what technology were behind it, actually write some code and figure out if there are any problems that we could solve. And I kind of started to look into it and talk to people. I realized that almost every biologist that you talk to uses BLAST. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, BLAST is this like hyper-optimized way of searching over nucleotides. It builds a very, very compressed index of them, and you can search very, very quickly for things that are kind of like the protein that you have or the sequence that you have. So it's a pretty specific tool. There's a couple different flavors of it. It's not necessarily the right tool for any job that you have, but because it's so fast and people have worked so hard on it from a computer science perspective, almost every biologist crams their idea into the BLAST kind of framework. So they'll like take the BLAST results and then they'll reprocess them a couple different ways, and that'll be their result. But it's almost never the optimal thing to do if you're a biologist. But because it's so fast, they end up using it. So my idea was that, well, Google has a lot of CPU, so we don't need to worry that much about optimization. Don't tell anyone I said that. Biologists have lots of ideas, and they don't know how to optimize necessarily. What they want to optimize is for the ideas that they've had, right? They want to optimize, like, I've got this great idea for identifying a new virus, or something like that, or figuring out if a virus is related to another one or if it's going to evolve in a certain way. They shouldn't have to think about the details. They should have to think about the biological implications of it, not about how to make it fast enough to run on their little, 12-core processor that's sitting, CPU, 12 CPUs that are sitting underneath their desk. So we have this kind of nice compatible arrangement, which is that Google has lots of CPUs. We don't have that much RAM because we keep things loaded like our search index at all times, so in case we need it. Biologists have lots of ideas. They don't have that much money. They can't buy tons of computers, so we kind of put these things together. So actually, I managed to get a lot of people excited about this one. I wrote some code. I took what we use for search indexing, rewrote a couple of modules of it, and tried to make it so that you could kind of input a, basically. With Python, you draw up your scoring algorithm, let's say, for your your matching. You want to match some DNA, and then we would run it on a much larger cluster, so you didn't have to worry about scaling it for DNA databases. Got lots of people excited about this. I ran out of time. Like I didn't really have much time to spend on actually turning this into a real idea. but a bunch of other people did. And so what ended up happening was, a couple of years later, I haven't been involved in a while, so I won't take any credit for this part of it, but we launched this thing a couple months ago called Exocycle, which is basically we're giving away a billion core hours of CPU to researchers to do all kinds of interesting things, everything from like geospatial imaging, medical research, astrophysics, computational biology, thankfully, stuck with it. So this is cool, right? I mean, like now basically scientists can have a relatively easy way to leverage the computational firepower that Google has. Google doesn't have to become an expert in astrophysics, which is not really our area of expertise. We can be an expert in running large data centers and scaling software and search and other things like that. So it's kind of a nice end result. Again, I won't take much credit for the end result, but I had a lot of fun at the beginning. So I just kind of want to wrap up. As Zach said before, 20% time is one of these like really flexible things, right? One of the great things from Google's perspective is that it gets a lot of good ideas, as you saw at the beginning. We get things like Gmail, we get things like Google News, Goggles, the art project. All of these things come out of 20% time. They're huge, they're fantastic, they're profitable. They make us make us a lot of money and a lot of happy users. We have a lot of happy engineers because the engineers get to do something maybe that's a little outside of their domain of expertise. They learn something, helps them find new projects if they want. 20% of the time is something that doesn't necessarily work, and I think that as an organization we accept that. There's probably for every Goggles there are dozens of live CDs lying on the ground, right? And that's okay, and we've kind of accepted that. It's definitely worth it in the end, right? It's a great time for experimentation. It's a great time to kind of have some fun as an engineer, blow off some steam. You can learn something new, you can teach, you can do things that aren't even technically related. As Zach said, a lot of people spend time teaching or volunteering for mentoring programs, and things like that. You can try something that's completely different than what you normally do in your day job, which I think is great. The recruiting pitches, that's a really great part of working at Google, and I think that's definitely true. It's definitely something that keeps me sane. It's good for the soul, and it's part of kind of our culture that I think keeps us kind of fresh and experimental. So anyway, so that's it. I think we're going to take some questions. So thanks. So there are microphones up on the aisles if anybody is interested. Just line up and we'll...
I'll start off.
Go ahead.
What determines when a 20% project is no longer viable?
That's a good question.
Well, two things. There's two exits for a 20% project. One is up and one is down. The down is often very clear because the engineer says, something, this is a bust, like live CD. Didn't quite go. It was fun, I learned something, but this wasn't going to go. And the other one is when it turns, like Goggles, it turns from a 20% project into a full-time project. And one of the critical pieces of the puzzle for that is that the management is expected to be not just tolerant of 20% projects, but supportive, i.e. when you see something that has gotten to the stage where you think it might go, you help it turn from skunk works into real works.
Yeah, I think the opposite is true also, right? I mean, like if you asked kind of how when it goes or when it doesn't, I think that as a manager you have a mentoring relationship, right? And part of 20% is learning when to stop, I think. And I've found it pretty rare that people don't know when something isn't going well. As nice as we are at Google, and people are always going to try to give you some positive feedback. I've almost never seen somebody not really get the message that something isn't really working out. And people are realists, and it's much more fun to work on something successful. So directing them on to something else that might be more fun and successful is usually pretty easy.
Hi guys, thanks for the talk. Two questions, same question, different angle. If somebody is an engineer within Google and they have an idea for something, but they know that there's some people outside Google who might be working on it and interested in that sort of collaboration. Part A, how would they go about that? Would that be tolerated? Second, if somebody's on the outside of Google and they can see synergies and interest for a great bunch of engineers in something they're doing, how would they access that to, if you like, drop a seed and say, hey, would you guys be interested in playing around with this?
The easy solution is we hire you. I don't know if anybody has a non-glib answer to that.
These things are tricky because as soon as you're dealing with an outside entity, you have to be respectful of other people's intellectual property. which typically means before you can start collaborating with somebody, you better have some kind of a contractual relationship in place. And that involves the business development people and negotiations and discussions. And when things are in very speculative stage, which is where most 20% projects are, that tends not to be a place where the folks outside are willing to say, oh yeah, I'll do this jointly with Google, and you can have a license in perpetuity. One of the reasons why it works here in practice is that your time is paid for by Google, and so there's a sort of a well understood principle that the work that you do on your 20% project is a work made for hire, and it's ultimately Google's. So as long as you're willing to make that deal to be exploratory and speculative with Google's time, with Google's nickel, and in exchange for that, you may get.
Has it ever happened, or is it just forget about it?
I don't know.
Yeah. I don't have any interest. I mean, there's certainly things like the art project that require a lot of external support, but the genesis is within, right? So I mean, like
there's some open source contributions.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, a lot of people do open source community work as their 20%, including open sourcing technology that is Google, and putting it out in the world. So.
Yeah, I mean, we have lots of people who contribute to 20% to open source activities on their 20% time. That's certainly quite common.
Forgive me for just going on. Very, very, very simply, right. Where would be a contact point to continue that conversation?
I think the good man has an idea.
Catch me afterwards.
Thank you, guys. I was wondering if you had any advice for companies that were going to set up their own 20% program, and at what stage of company growth would you set up that, because I mean, if you're in the startup phase, it would be really kind of challenging to set up that 20% program. So what stage of growth would you recommend that companies set that program up?
I'm not convinced that the startup stage is a bad time for 20%, actually. I'd almost argue, well, maybe the idea is that a startup, it's all 20% time. But I think any size company, I think you can have this idea of giving people some free rein to try out ideas that they have.
I guess the startup issue would be you want to be hyper-focused on that one thing you're trying to launch. But yeah, sure. If you can find 20% stuff that might help that one thing, have different facets, that could be cool.
Yeah. Also, a startup is in this mode where, everybody is focused on the goal for the startup itself. So, what that basically means is there's no turf. Okay, and if we're in a startup together and your thing needs some of my time, it's going to get it. Okay, so is that 20% time? Is that a formal thing? Who knows?
Yeah, so to get back to your original question about what you can do to kind of encourage 20% and how to set it up, I think that some of the points at the end were kind of targeted at that. Like I think as the leadership of the company has to be tolerant of obviously people spending time not on their main project. That's probably the first hurdle to get over. I think you have to be tolerant of failure a lot. Like you have to be tolerant that this is experimental. It's throwing things against the wall and seeing what sticks. And I think you have to be supportive of the engineers, both in terms of when it's successful and in terms of when it fails, right? So obviously, if it fails, you're supposed to be supportive and get them going on something else because that can be demoralizing. But it's even more important to be supportive of the successes. Because if someone makes something that's obviously good and cool and you squash it because you don't want them to spend more than 20% of their time on it, that's actually really, I think, even worse than not having 20% time at all. So you have to be willing to deal with the success of 20%. You have to be willing to deal with Google News coming out. Google was very small when Google News came out. There were probably only 40 or 50 people at Google at that point. And then we had to get behind it because it was obviously the right thing to do and put real engineering power behind it. So I think you have to be willing to cope with both outcomes.
Two questions. Is the business card application of Goggles out on the market yet?
Yeah.
And is it a separate app or?
No, you take a picture of a business card with Goggles and it'll offer to add it to your contacts. Yeah.
Okay. And then is there a graveyard of dead 20% projects or a way of like putting Live CD together with Chrome OS, things like that? How do you do that? How do you synergize?
Yeah, I mean, I offered just a bunch of ideas that I'd had when Chrome OS was getting spun up, but honestly, they'd already thought of all of them. So, I mean, I think, there's certainly a long there's always a bunch of people at Google that have thought of interesting things, with whatever your new project is, and it's good to kind of go and talk to them. Yeah, I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know that you need to force it necessarily. I guess people.
How do you find them if you're like, has someone tried this before?
Documentation, really. I mean, like maybe this is just me. I think a lot of people at Google are good. Yeah, use Google internally, right? Use our internal search. Everybody if you write down what you did, then someone will find it. I think that's probably the best way.
Yeah, hi, my name is Varmint, and my question is, at what point does a 20% project become so compelling to the engineer that the best course of action for that person or team is to drop out of Google and launch a startup, and how often does that happen?
Well, as Marc pointed out before, it doesn't, because the work that you do at Google is Google's. So that's kind of the contract that you sign, right? Is that you're doing work, it's using Google's hardware, it's using Google's time effectively. So that's kind of the bargain that you make. But the flip side of that bargain is that you have all the resources of Google. You have all of these machines, all of this technology, all of the search, all of the all the platform to use to make it that much better.
And other engineers, one of the common things is, you get a bunch of your buddies together to do work on your 20% project with you. Most of them are not single person things. It's often lots of other people involved. Yeah,
arguably it's a startup without any of the risk. Because you can work on it, you have your buddies, free funding, no funding problems, no salary problems, you can still pay your rent.
Okay. Hi, I'm so happy to hear the details of the art project, because I'm so interested in art. I have a question. I'm sure that a lot of museums and institutions, they worry about the possibility that their works were kind of stolen. I mean, their pictures by someone or some kind of institutions. So have you developed any kind of protection, the technology to prevent someone from stealing the images or kind of any intellectual properties from the website?
The museums keep the ownership of everything that's up there. We don't have any particularly aggressive DRM machinery in there. That's hasn't turned out to be necessary. The quantity of data involved is such that it's non-trivial to steal. So it hasn't been a huge concern. Partly because, again, for this particular thing, the pictures that were put up are sort of very well known. So it's not like you're going to come along and say, "Oh, look, I've got images of Starry Night." They don't represent any kind of economic threat to the museums, because the pieces are too notorious to be stolen in that way.
You mentioned before a project that kind of started one way, ended up some other way. Are there? Do you have any examples of the projects where they actually were facing failure? It looked like there was no point in it, and then somehow it turned around and turned into something reasonably successful?
Almost every project has that experience.
Yeah, what project has not almost
failed?
Where
you're at the precipice of, like, you say, well, you should know this one's a failure, but they kept going. And
well, the art project, at several points when we had unsuccessful meetings with some of the museums, there were those of us who were going, I don't know if this is going to go, guys. There were times when we were in the dumps, but we persevered and it came out well.
Yeah, the biology project was actually one of those. We had a lot of support early on, and we went one route. We had a bunch of excitement, executive level excitement about it, and went one route to try to kind of fund it and turn it into a real project, and that ended up collapsing. And that's the point at which I drifted off, but other people persevered and ended up becoming an actual, a real kind of thing. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess the spreadsheet project I did, there were other engineers in here who worked on it too. There were a few times when we were like, this might not work, and we were, a year into it, and we were fortunate enough not to. Our managers supported it even throughout. There was no moment where they were like, this isn't going to work, let's stop.
Yeah.
Could you clarify, you talk about engineers having 20% time. Does this apply to non-development engineers, user interface specialists, documentation specialists, business development people?
Yeah, as far as I know, yeah.
Well, the formal program is in the what's called engineering and operations part of Google, which means basically software engineers, SRE, which is the folks who run the systems, and product management. Biz dev is not part of NJOPS. I mean, I'm sorry, we're getting into bureaucratic detail here. So the answer is it doesn't extend to everybody, but it extends to essentially the engineering organization.
Yeah, and incidentally, I find that people that want to do something 20% like will make the time. You know, just really, the only difference is really whether it's the 80% to 100% time or it's 100% to 120% of your time, right?
A perfect example of that was, in fact, there was the health project, which we recently announced that we were shutting down, had a large cast of volunteers from the sales organization who were donating their 20% time. Sales doesn't formally have 20% time. So, but, you know, again, as Andrew observed, if the will is there, we'll generally find a way.
I am Dan Eldridge. That was actually part of my question. Is it only engineers? And seeing that it's not, how has the program changed over time, or has it? What sort of, as engineers, what sort of measurements and observations have you been measuring over time? And is there a best practices, as someone else asked earlier, is it a published or formalized best practice within somewhat of the formalized program, which I'm hearing does exist someplace?
You know,
we should write that down, actually, yeah. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, those are good questions.
And does it differ office to office, and is there competition among the offices, or which office is most effective? I mean,
we don't, that I know of, have fine-grained metrics on this. One of the things that we know as managers is that the number of people who choose to participate in 20% projects is always, in my opinion, disappointingly small. That is, there's plenty of them going on and people are encouraged, but I find that I spend a certain amount of my time exhorting people to have the, you know, to sort of take the time, step back from their 80% project and do that. Because, you know, people, it's very easy to be very wrapped up in your current thing, particularly if it's gnarly and hard and sort of tricky technology. People often go, I don't want to be distracted by that. I'm too focused on this. And, you know, that's fine. We don't force them to take 20% time.
Yeah, I also think it's kind of like a quantum, you know, wave function. Like if you observe it too closely, it's going to collapse, right? So I think, sorry, no physics jokes, no, okay. So I mean, like if you institutionalize it too much, you're going to hurt exactly what it's trying to encourage, which is kind of disregard for the current, you know, framework of things. So while we do measure it in terms of asking people questions, are you taking 20% time, you know, do you find that it's encouraged and so on like that, as far as like formalizing the process by which you choose a 20% project or having competitions maybe even between offices, I'm not sure that that's...
having, I would say, yeah. You observed it or something like that, but I forget who it was that said if you can't improve it, if you can't measure it. Well,
we have a clearinghouse website internally where people who have ideas but maybe not time or not the right skills post suggestions for 20% projects. That's particularly popular with non-engineers who would like engineers to work on things of that sort. So there's a bunch of things of that sort, but you know, we'd certainly like to see more of it.
As questions increase, a quick question for all of you. Are you Wikipedians? Yes, no, yes, no. Are each of you Wikipedians?
What does that mean?
As in like contribute to Wikipedia?
Yes.
Of course.
I have, yes.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so
I don't have my membership card on me.
So one thing I've noticed that like large corporations sometimes, you know, ideas, you know, that you would kind of be contributing are widely accepted, but then the problem comes into play when you need hardware or CPU cycles. So, you know, 20% time, I guess that's of your own time, but let's say your 20% project actually required, you know, a whole bunch of Tomcats and Apaches and everything like that. I mean, where are those going to come from? Is there something
How many CPUs do you need?
Yeah, that's kind of the nice thing about Google. If it's machine resources you need, that's easy. Like that was the whole point of the bioinformatics project.
Just type a command. Boom.
Yeah, yeah. We have lots of spare cycles. It's actually probably the other types of resources, like personal resources, UX resources, things like that are more constrained.
So you don't have to kind of get this through bureaucracy and put it through the different.
Every engineer can run jobs on any one of our machines.
Type a command.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I have two questions. First is how many, so what's the percentage of new products that have come through this 20% experiment?
Percentage, I don't know.
Offhand?
I mean, I showed you at the
Yeah.
beginning the logos of a bunch of things that started as 20% projects. So it's a substantial number.
There's not a lot of top-down, products, new product kind of things. Obviously, like Android was,
Yeah,
it wasn't a 20% project, but
within Google Docs, I can think of at least 3 or 4 things: the document list, the scripting engine, the different editors, the technology behind them. That all started as 20%. So significant. Yeah.
My second question is that these projects start as individual projects, but how exactly does internal collaboration work for these? So you started as an idea which an engineer will bring, but how do you then collaborate internally to grow that idea?
Yeah.
I mean, people sit around, at lunchtime and say, gee, if we did blah, and it's like, well, yeah, we could do that. And then, like, all of a sudden there's, a little set of Java files being grown and change lists being reviewed, and suddenly there's something going on.
Yeah, the typical thing, I think, is someone starts with a demo. It's like someone will just make something in their free time and show it to people, and they'll think it's cool and get people interested, and then it kind of takes off from there.
Yeah, we try to have a lot of encouragement. I mean, like we have a weekly, this actually started on one, I worked on Google Squared for a while, which wasn't quite a 20% project, but had lots of sub-projects in it that were kind of spare time things. And we have a weekly beer and demos where we would kind of, for every Friday at 4:30, grab a couple 6-packs, everyone shows off what they've done, and we've expanded that now. The entire office does it every Friday, and other offices have picked this up. So I mean, like, that's a good place. Like, you show off, hey, this is the cool thing that I built, and someone comes by, and all of a sudden you've got like 6 20%ers all working on the same project. Yeah. So.
Right. Yeah, beer and demos is
Thank
good.
you.
Hi, I'm Ronald, and first of all, I just want to say great job with today. I love seeing all the foot traffic double on the museums. That was really fascinating and amazing to hear. It's a great job. My question is, in regards to one of the responses earlier, you said that there's actually like a database where people can post their ideas they don't have time to work on, or if sometimes it's the business people that post it, they can't do it themselves. Or how often do you see developers really take on one of those projects, or a developer have failed on a project but another one picks up on it a few years later, and seeing those really roll out into successes?
Well, I don't know the direct answer to that, but for example, we have an annual event here in New York called Sales Eng Immersion, in which we pair up a salesperson and an engineer for a day, and the engineer shadows the salesperson and just kind of observes them and listens to them and hangs out with them all day. And out of that, over the course of the last several years, have come at least 2 fairly substantial new internal products that have substantially improved the way we serve the customer base in the advertising space. So, again, the key challenge in all of this kind of stuff is how do you create a connection between a need and some creativity? And unfortunately, you can't formalize that too much, because, as Andrew said, if you shine too much of a bright light on it, it disappears. So we do what we can to kind of foment that communication and sharing and conversation, and then we just hope things work. Yeah.
Hi, how are you? I'm Dan Galanti. I just wanted to say I think your 20% projects are amazing. And my question is, how do you get sales and marketing to collaborate with you when you come up to them with an idea? How do you generate that enthusiasm, and what channels do you use? I mean, I know you think it's great, but how do you get them and the world to see your vision?
Like I said, we have this immersion program where we pair them up. The sales guys have their jobs to do, and they live in a world that engineers don't understand, and vice versa. By making them spend a day together, you force them to have a set of conversations which start out sort of uneasy, are you a human being? Yes, I am. Are you? Okay, and it goes on to, and a number of these immersion relationships have developed into, we have lunch once a month, we talk about what's going on, and it has sort of begun to break down some of the I don't understand you, I don't understand your language thing that keeps groups that are in different areas apart. Is that, there's no magic to this. People talking to each other generally break down the barriers.
So it's almost like a task force in a way, where it's more like informal, so it's not so much sales.
But it's not a task force because we don't set out a goal.
Right, okay.
We just say, talk to one another.
Okay, fair enough.
So Google must be a very unusual organization. As it's grown, has local optimization set in, and managers try to get their employees to do their work, and therefore, if they're doing too much work on the 20% project, or they're really engaged in the 20%, but not as much in the 80% project, the manager doesn't. Do people get rewarded at annual review time based on their 20% work as well as their 80% work? That's sort of the key.
Yeah,
it's a balance, right? I mean,
I would say this is one of the biggest challenges of 20% is that people who, they feel like it might take away from their main job and worry that they're not spending enough time on their main thing. And you worry that your manager wouldn't support you, but as a manager, you're supposed to support this, and it's an important part of the culture that you encourage people to try and get outside of their normal job.
So we also have a lot of managers that were engineers, right? I mean, I think that also helps. I mean, as a manager now, I recognize the need for 20% time, and the need for being able to have an outlet and the need to support that. So I said you have to be very supportive of that kind of thing. And the hardest part is when somebody's project is successful and they need to not work on your project anymore. And that one is, it's tough, but it's not, as you said, it's a global optimization, not a local one.
So a partial answer to that is that, in our annual performance review process, one of the things that every engineer does is a self-assessment. And one of the things that you do in your self-assessment is you say, what did I do? And so you put I put my contributions to the art project into my self-assessment saying I worked on it. So and so the people, the 360, the folks who are appraising me, my peers and colleagues, see that and they say, oh, how important was his contribution and all that kind of stuff. And then my manager, when he's sort of going over the whole thing, sees the assertion and the supporting commentary and takes it into account or not. I mean, again, it's not one of these things where you can put a heavy metric machine on it, because as soon as that happens, you begin to crush it out. And what we're pretty good about is recognizing it. So, if you create Gmail, you can count on the fact that you're going to be recognized and rewarded. Or the art project, people have been recognized for that quite effectively.
I remember Orchid was a 20% project, wasn't it originally?
Yes, it was.
But it wasn't on your list of slides. Was it considered an orphan or something?
We cannot possibly list every 20% project. There have been thousands of them, I'm sure. So
yeah.
and hundreds of successful.
Through social networks.
Yeah.
Right.
Sort of talked about people can have an idea, propose it, start working on it. They might have a proof of concept. They might get to a live demo that they can share. Could you talk a bit more about the process of how does it go live, exposed to the whole world, and who looks at that, or what are they looking for as a hurdle to go from, it works in one instance internally, several people have seen it, to anybody in the world can use it and use it a lot?
Yeah. So one of the ones in Docs I can think about that started off with a demo was the scripting thing. And basically that was just people within Docs were like, this is cool. And we tend to, I think at Google, have the attitude, if you have something that we think is cool, let's just throw it out and see if people actually use it. And for 20% stuff, it's probably the same. So for this, we launched it, and the response was positive. And then from there, it sort of got more support as more people used it.
We will take, I think we're running out of time, so we will take the last 4 that are online, and you don't have to walk away. You can. You were one of the 4. Yeah. So go ahead.
Bob Gazelter. Marc, just a thought. This 20% would seem to be in the same constellation as professional development. and effectively an internal venture capital fund of sorts. Right? What you're effectively doing is making sure people stay current and stay professionally developed, and oh yes, develop new ideas without having to generate a bureaucracy to vet them. Would that be an unfair characterization?
I think that's reasonably fair. I mean, you know, the thing we know is that creativity does not follow organizational hierarchy lines, and the part of the whole point of this is to let that creativity flower without you know, it's much too easy for managers to casually squelch things, not even with hostility, but carelessly. And so the elegance of the 20% project concept is that it protects things when they're small and fragile,
Yes.
and lets them demonstrate themselves.
And the flip side is, and this is an interesting question, which somewhat is probably a hot potato a little bit, but if you find people who don't want to spend 20%, do you notice a correlation, I'm not talking about people who are very deeply immersed in a particular project, but in a negative ability to keep fresh professionally?
No, you know,
I'm talking
again,
long term, not a 6 month or a year, but consistently. Are you seeing any problems in that respect?
You know, I don't, as a manager, pay attention to who's not doing 20% projects. I do exhort them to do it, but you know, I view that as I view that as fertilizing the field by scattering the fertilizer. I don't go say, hey, you know, Bob, you know, why the hell aren't you doing a 20% project? You got no imagination? I mean, that's a good way to squelch you too.
I've seen, the reason I raise that question is that I've seen in a lot of organizations is pedal to the metal on actual tasking. As a result, 3 to 5 years downstream, the entire team is professionally way behind. Burned out, way behind on technologies. And then everybody's looking at themselves saying, well, how do we assimilate this new technology? And the answer is everybody's been at 125% power for the last 5 years. There's no time to learn anything. We're now suddenly wiped out.
Yeah, I think 20% time is a better long-term strategy than pedal to the metal. Sir.
Hi, great presentation. I have a question. I come up with a 20% project and it becomes successful. Do I get like a bonus or job security or like?
It certainly, it certainly doesn't hurt. You know, like David Petru, who came up with goggles, is doing quite well career-wise and everything like that. You know, I'm not going to tell you about his bonus or anything like that. But, you know, it's definitely a good thing. I mean, I think you get a lot of career trajectory at Google is about being, you know, having ownership and having impact and having, you know, kind of breadth and responsibility. And this is a great way to kind of get at the ground level on something that will become broad and impactful and have a lot of responsibility. Yeah.
Hi, my question is, have you guys, are there any 20% projects that try to improve the delivery of government services or try to address social challenges that you guys can cite, or are there any interests? Does Google allow for that?
Addressing social challenges, there's lots of that. I mean, both in terms of, there's all kinds of volunteering things. We didn't talk much about those. We really focused on sort of the creative, entrepreneurial kinds of things in most of the questions. But in addition, for example, there's a team that's now part of .org that's called Crisis Response that had its genesis in some people going in response to the big earthquake in Haiti not long ago. Hey, gee, we should go down there and see what we can figure out to do to help. Okay, we didn't have any idea quite what we could do to help. Some interesting things like People Finder came out of that, but that had as its genesis some of the same 20% approach to things. Whether it was formally 20% or not in its starting instant, I don't know exactly, but there's a lot of that. I mean,
I was involved in one for Hurricane Katrina, same thing actually. It didn't actually get turned into a project, unfortunately, so we had to do it all over again for the earthquake in Japan and Haiti and other things like that. But Yeah, those things happen a lot. The other one I was, Fruitrends also came out of .org, which I think is another good example of that sort of thing.
So do those usually end up with the .org?
.org certainly is a good place for that kind of, yeah, I guess what we traditionally call nonprofit kind of, kind of things. Yeah.
Thank you.
This question is in the context of just professional development and not business, if you will. But and it's a subjective question. Is how have you seen, just from the? It sounds like these projects are. Someone gets a very accelerated view of product development, from the idea to going through the steps of launching it, which maybe on a big project they're in one piece of that cycle. How have you seen it kind of affect people, just in general, how they approach things afterwards, after having had this very different experience, not just in what they're focused on, but the breadth of what they end up focusing on?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to the example of David from Goggles. I mean, he was always kind of an inventive, entrepreneurial kind of person. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have done this sort of thing in the first place. But he has a lot of these skills now. Not only is he, I think, a better people person. Like he was a very heads down kind of engineer, but this has exposed him to having to deal, not only with the inception, as you said, of a project, but selling it, getting support for it, understanding how it fits in organizationally, corralling other kinds of resources, UX resources, product resources, biz dev, all those kinds of things. So I think, yeah, you're right. It's very much, the successful ones are very much an education, to the point before about kind of being like venture capital. It's also like being an entrepreneur, I think, within Google.
Let me ask the question a little, because I guess what I really mean is most of them are probably unsuccessful in terms of, commercializing, but yet people have this experience that may be very just valuable in the long run. And I'm more asking about that than the huge successes.
We think it encourages a healthy attitude towards risk taking, which we think is crucial to career development in general. I think that one of the ways in which Google is different from the average bear technology firm is that we try to really foment a sort of an entrepreneurial spirit, which is, people could generally believe it's not possible in a large corporation. And, at Google, we sort of view ourselves as an ongoing experiment. How do you, in fact, grow without losing that kind of spirit and culture? And this is one of our ways of trying to preserve the creative spirit. Well, thank you all very much for your time and attention.